Picture a tiny, everyday sewing thimble. Now picture a massive 500-liter brewing tank. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a microscopic thriller. It's a story of literal chemical warfare happening right inside your glass. We are tracking an invisible invader, one that absolutely destroys flavor, ruins clarity, and leaves permanent scars on the beer. And the numbers here are honestly terrifying. It takes just 0.5 parts per million of dissolved oxygen to initiate the irreversible destruction of an entire batch. That's a volume of gas you can barely even comprehend, let alone see. To put that into perspective, tipping just a single thimble of air into that massive 500-liter tank is enough to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. So you might be wondering, how does beer stand a chance? Well, it starts with a powerful biological shield.
During fermentation, yeast acts as the beer's ultimate guardian. It does an amazing job absorbing unpleasant compounds like diacetyl, and it actively scavenges oxygen, aggressively mopping it up. But the second a brewer filters that beer to make it beautifully clear, that living shield is gone. The kingdom is completely defenseless.
Because of this extreme vulnerability, professional brewers are held to an incredibly strict standard. They have to keep dissolved oxygen below 100 parts per billion in the final packaged beer. That's 0.1 parts per million. Any higher than that, and the war is already lost.
Let's move to Section 1, Chemical Warfare and Flavor Destruction.
If you've ever had a stale beer, you already know exactly what this invader does. You get that flat, papery, wet cardboard taste, right? The specific chemical weapon responsible for that cardboard flavor is called trans-2-nonenal, and its perception threshold is brutally low, between just 50 and 100 nanograms per liter. Literally billions of a gram is all it takes to ruin your palate.
Here's how the attack actually goes down. When oxygen enters the bottle, it immediately attacks the lipids derived from the malt. Enzymes catalyze this reaction, forming hydroxides, which then break down into those nasty aldehydes. And here's where it gets so much worse. Simple chemistry dictates that heat dramatically accelerates this reaction. Leaving an oxygen-contaminated beer on a warm shelf is a disastrous multiplier for flavor destruction.
Now, this chemical warfare actually manifests differently depending on the exact beer style. Darker malts and a higher alcohol content offer slightly more reducing power. So while light lagers suffer heavily, developing sweet, papery, and metallic notes, your stronger ales and stouts degrade a bit differently, leaning more toward molasses, toffee, dried fruit, or sherry-like characteristics.
But here's a crucial point, a detail that should genuinely alarm you as a beer lover. If you measure that beer later, the dissolved oxygen might actually read as absolute zero. The oxygen disappears rapidly because it gets consumed in the very reactions it initiates. It doesn't have to stick around, it just has to be there long enough to pull the trigger. Once it does, the oxidative chain reaction is irreversibly marching forward.
Now, let's pivot to Section 2, the haze battlefield.
This brilliantly illustrates peacetime. In a perfectly clear, haze-free beer, simple flavanols and protein molecules are just minding their own business. They float freely in the liquid, completely separate. The beer is crystal clear.
But watch what happens when the invader strikes. Oxygen is introduced, and those polyphenols oxidize. They start forming these loose, weak bonds with proteins, creating clusters. When the beer gets cold, these clusters drop out of solution, creating a cloudy appearance we call chill haze. Now, it's reversible. If you warm the beer up, it clears. But chill haze is simply a warning sign that the enemy has breached the gates.
If that chemical warfare continues, those weak bonds transform into strong, irreversible covalent bonds. The molecules lock together into large, tangled aggregates, and this is permanent haze. Even if you warm the beer up, the cloudiness remains. It's a fixed scar of chemical warfare that will literally never dissolve.
So, we know the damage this invisible invader inflicts on both flavor and clarity. But the big question is, how does it actually get in?
This brings us straight to the mechanical front lines on the brewery floor. Let's look at the typical points of exposure where our microscopic invader breaches the walls. It can be impure process gases from old CO2 plants, microscopic gaps in pipe joints, or even rinse water that hasn't had the oxygen stripped out of it. But one of the absolute worst culprits? Leaky pump shaft seals and valve seals on suction lines. A tiny leak right there acts exactly like a carburetor on an engine, literally sucking atmospheric air straight into the flowing beer.
And the basic physics of the brewery just makes it worse. Anytime you agitate the beer or it rushes through a turbulent pipe bend, you dramatically increase the surface area of the liquid that's exposed to the air.
More surface area means faster molecular invasion. It's a fight being waged at every single bend, joint, and valve in the entire system.
Which leads us to Section 3, the brewer's layered defense.
You obviously can't fight an invisible enemy if you can't detect it, right? So breweries use two main types of sensors to monitor dissolved oxygen in real time. The older electrochemical sensors from the 1970s use a membrane and an electrical current, but they're slow, taking 30 seconds or more to register a breach. Modern optical sensors, introduced around 2008, are incredible. They shoot an intense pulse of blue light into the beer and measure the red fluorescence that bounces back. Oxygen actually quenches that red light. So by measuring the light, brewers get instant, low-maintenance readings on the exact oxygen levels in the pipes.
The defense literally has to maintain insanely strict tolerances to win this war. Just look at these targets. In the fermentation vessel before transfer, brewers want dissolved oxygen below 10 parts per billion. In the maturation tank, 50 parts per billion. Every single step of the way, they are fighting tooth and nail to keep contamination to absolute microscopic minimums before that final package is sealed.
To hit those microscopic targets, brewers rely on a heavily layered defense. They store beer near 0 degrees Celsius because cold dramatically slows down those oxidative chemical reactions. They flush miles of pipework with deaerated water to push out any air. They fill tanks from the bottom at slow, calculated speeds to avoid turbulent splashing. They even designed vertical tanks specifically to reduce the liquid's surface area. And as a final, last resort defense mechanism, some brewers actually embed chemical oxygen scavengers directly into the bottle caps to absorb any stray oxygen trapped in the headspace.
There is, however, one absolutely fascinating exception to all this high-tech warfare: traditional cask-conditioned beer. Why does cask beer survive air ingress? Because it still contains active, living yeast. That biological shield we talked about at the very beginning is still alive in the cask, actively scavenging and mopping up the oxygen before it can ruin the beer. The biology elegantly compensates for what the engineering misses.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. The enemy of great beer isn't the brewer's recipe, it's an invisible, odorless gas. So the next time you're sitting at a bar and you hold up a cloudy pint to the light at room temperature, I want you to ask yourself a question. Is this just a temporary chill haze, or am I looking at the permanent, irreversible scars of chemical warfare? Because that isn't just a beer in your glass, it's a battlefield. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning what's really happening inside your glass.